The roar of jet engines had become nothing more than background noise to Captain Sarah read Kozlov as she calibrated the fuel mixture sensors for the third time that morning. Her weathered hands moved with practiced precision across the diagnostic panel, each adjustment made with the kind of muscle memory that comes from 20 years of keeping aircraft airborne. The hangar buzzed with pre-flight activity around her, mechanics and technicians preparing for what everyone knew would be the most dangerous rescue mission attempted in the last decade. But Sarah wasn't part of the crew heading into harm's way. She was ground support now, relegated to the shadows of a career that had once put her in the cockpit of the most advanced fighter jets the Air Force had ever built. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, its pale light struggling to penetrate the thick clouds that had been building for days. Weather reports showed a massive storm system moving in from the Bering Sea, the kind of front that could ground entire squadrons and make flying conditions lethal for even the most experienced pilots. But somewhere in the Aleutian wilderness, a research team was stranded on an ice shelf that was breaking apart with each passing hour. Their emergency beacon had been transmitting for 36 hours, and satellite imagery showed their position deteriorating rapidly as chunks of ice the size of city blocks calved into the churning ocean below. Sarah adjusted her faded flight jacket and stepped back from the fuel console, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better days. The jacket still bore the patches from her previous assignments, squadron insignias that told the story of a decorated combat pilot who had flown missions over Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. But those days felt like another lifetime now buried under years of medical evaluations, fitness reviews, and the slow bureaucratic process that had eventually grounded her permanently. A training accident 3 years ago had left her with chronic pain in her left leg and occasional tremors in her hands, conditions that the flight surgeons deemed incompatible with active flying status. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same hands, now considered too unreliable for combat flying, were steady enough to maintain the aircraft that other pilots trusted with their lives. The mission briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours in the main operations center, and Sarah knew better than to expect an invitation. She'd learned about the rescue operation the same way she learned about everything else on the base, by reading maintenance reports, listening to scattered conversations, and piecing together fragments of information that others assumed she wouldn't understand or care about. The research team was trapped on Glacier Bay Island, approximately 400 nautical miles from the nearest airfield, surrounded by weather conditions that had already forced 2 previous rescue attempts to turn back. The window for extraction was closing rapidly as the storm system approached, bringing with it winds that would make flying impossible for at least a week. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the squadron commander, had assembled his best pilots for the mission. Captain Jennifer Phoenix Rodriguez, with her reputation for precision flying in extreme conditions. Major David Iceman Thompson, whose calm demeanor under pressure had earned him commendations from 3 different combat theaters. Captain Michael Viper Sullivan, the youngest pilot in the squadron but already recognized as having exceptional skill in low-altitude navigation. They were good pilots, Sarah acknowledged, perhaps even great ones. But they were also pilots who had never flown the specific aircraft configuration required for this type of extreme weather rescue. Pilots who had trained in simulators but never felt the real weight of a fully loaded transport aircraft fighting against wind shear and ice. Accumulation. Sarah made her way across the hangar floor, her boots echoing against the concrete as she passed the massive C-130J Super Hercules that would carry the rescue team into the storm. The aircraft was a testament to engineering excellence, capable of landing on rough terrain and operating in conditions that would ground most other planes. But Sarah knew that capability meant nothing without a pilot who understood how to exploit every advantage the aircraft offered. She ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the subtle vibrations that indicated the auxiliary power unit was running within normal parameters. Her fingers traced the rivets and panels with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours learning every system, every backup procedure, every emergency protocol that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. The maintenance logs showed that the aircraft had been fitted with specialized equipment for the rescue mission. Extended range fuel tanks that would allow for the long flight to Glacier Bay Island and back, even with the detours required to avoid the worst of the storm system. Medical equipment and survival gear that would give the research team their best chance of surviving the extraction process. Most importantly, the aircraft had been equipped with an advanced weather radar system and ice protection equipment that would theoretically allow it to penetrate the storm conditions that had turned back the previous rescue attempts. Sarah climbed the crew ladder and stepped into the aircraft's cargo bay, her movements automatic despite the fact that she wasn't officially part of the mission crew. The space was configured for medical evacuation, with stretchers and medical equipment secured along the walls. The research team consisted of 6 people, including 2 who were reportedly suffering from hypothermia and exposure after their temporary shelter had been damaged by shifting ice. Every minute of delay increased the risk that the rescue would become a body recovery operation, a possibility that hung over the entire base like the approaching storm clouds. The pilot's seat felt familiar beneath her as she settled into the cockpit, even though she wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah had logged over 3,000 hours in various configurations of the C-130. From combat missions in hostile territory to humanitarian relief operations in disaster zones. She knew the aircraft systems better than most pilots knew their own cars, understood the subtle differences between manual and automatic flight controls, could feel through the control stick and rudder pedals exactly how the aircraft was responding to changing conditions. But official policy was clear: grounded pilots were not authorized for flight operations under any circumstances. The pre-flight checklist lay open on the center console, each item methodically checked off by the maintenance crew who had prepared the aircraft for the mission. Sarah's eyes scanned the list automatically, her mind processing the information with the kind of systematic approach that had kept her alive through dozens of combat missions. The fuel load was calculated for maximum range with emergency reserves. The weight and balance figures showed optimal configuration for the expected flight conditions, and the weather briefing indicated that the mission would be launched during a brief window of improved conditions that meteorologists predicted would last approximately 4 hours. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the rescue team assembling near the operations building, their gear piled in neat stacks as they waited for the final mission authorization. The parascumen, known as PJs, were among the most highly trained special operations personnel in the military, capable of providing medical care and extraction services in the most extreme environments. Their equipment included specialized cold weather gear, medical supplies, and the kind of technical rescue equipment that would allow them to extract the research team from an unstable ice shelf. But all of their training and equipment would be useless if they couldn't reach the target location, and that depended entirely on having a pilot who could navigate the storm system that had defeated 2 previous attempts. Sarah's radio crackled with pre-mission communications as various teams reported their readiness status. The weather forecast was being updated in real time, with meteorologists tracking the storm system's movement and intensity. The latest reports showed that the window for the rescue mission was narrowing faster than originally predicted, with the storm system accelerating as it moved inland from the Bering Sea. Wind speeds at the target location were already approaching the upper limits for safe aircraft operations, and ice accumulation rates were increasing with each passing hour. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on Sarah as she sat in the pilot's seat of an aircraft she wasn't authorized to fly, listening to preparations for a mission that everyone acknowledged was at the very edge of feasibility. She had more experience in extreme weather flying than any other pilot on the base, had successfully completed missions in conditions that had grounded entire squadrons, possessed an intimate knowledge of the specific aircraft type that would be used for the rescue. But none of that mattered to the bureaucratic systems that determined fitness for flight duty, systems that valued medical clearances and regulatory compliance over operational experience and practical knowledge. The mission commander's voice echoed across the base's communication system, announcing that the rescue operation was approved for immediate launch. Sarah remained in the cockpit, knowing that she would soon be asked to leave so that the official crew could begin their pre-flight procedures. She took one last look at the instrument panel, her eyes automatically checking the readings that indicated the aircraft's status and readiness. Everything showed green, optimal conditions for what should have been a routine transport mission to a routine destination. But there was nothing routine about flying into a storm system that had already forced 2 experienced crews to abort their missions, nothing routine about attempting to land on an ice shelf that was breaking apart beneath the feet of the people they were trying to save. As Sarah prepared to leave the cockpit, she noticed something that made her pause. The weight and balance calculation on the mission planning sheet showed a configuration that was technically within acceptable limits, but barely. The combination of maximum fuel load, rescue equipment, medical supplies, and the expected weight of 6 additional passengers would put the aircraft very close to its maximum gross weight limit. Under normal conditions, that wouldn't be a significant concern. But the extreme weather conditions they would encounter meant that the aircraft would need every possible advantage in terms of performance and maneuverability. Operating at maximum weight would reduce climb performance, increase stall speeds, and make the aircraft more susceptible to the kind of severe turbulence that was forecast for the mission route. The oversight was subtle, the kind of detail that might escape notice during the pressure and urgency of mission planning. Sarah had seen similar miscalculations before, usually during complex operations where multiple variables had to be balanced against competing priorities. The mission planners had focused on ensuring that the aircraft could carry everything necessary for the rescue while maintaining sufficient fuel reserves for the return flight. But they had apparently not fully considered how the weight would affect the aircraft's ability to handle the severe weather conditions that made the mission so dangerous in the first place. Sarah stepped down from the cockpit and made her way toward the hangar exit, her mind already working through the implications of what she had observed. The official crew would discover the weight issue during their own pre-flight checks, but by then the mission launch window might be compromised. Every minute of delay increased the risk to the stranded research team and decreased the likelihood that weather conditions would remain within acceptable limits for the rescue attempt. The storm system was moving faster than predicted, and the narrow window of opportunity was closing with each passing hour. The morning air was crisp and sharp. As Sarah stepped outside the hangar, carrying with it the smell of jet fuel and the promise of the approaching storm. Around her, the base was alive with activity as personnel prepared for what everyone knew would be a challenging and dangerous mission. But Sarah walked away from the activity, away from the aircraft she couldn't fly and the mission she couldn't join, carrying with her the knowledge that the rescue operation was about to encounter problems that no one else had recognized. She was just ground support now, a former pilot whose experience and expertise were valued only for maintaining aircraft rather than flying them. But deep inside, she knew that before the day was over, everything would change. The operations center buzzed with controlled tension as Lieutenant Colonel Webb reviewed the mission parameters one final time. Maps covered every available surface, marked with flight routes, weather patterns, and contingency plans that had been refined through multiple iterations over the past 12 hours. The rescue team stood at attention around the briefing table, their faces reflecting the gravity of a mission that everyone understood pushed the boundaries of what was considered feasible. Webb's voice carried the authority of someone who had led dozens of similar operations. But Sarah could hear the underlying concern that came with sending his people into conditions that had already proven treacherous. Sarah positioned herself near the back of the room, close enough to hear the briefing, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to her presence. Her status as ground support gave her access to most areas of the base, but she was careful not to overstep the invisible boundaries that separated operational personnel from maintenance staff. The mission details unfolded with military precision. As Webb outlined the challenges they would face, the timeline they had to work within, and the contingencies that had been planned for various scenarios. But Sarah noticed gaps in the briefing, assumptions that were being made about aircraft performance and weather conditions that didn't align with her own understanding of the situation. Captain Rodriguez, Calcine Phoenix, leaned forward over the mission map as Webb traced the planned flight route. Her reputation for precision flying was well earned, built on years of successful missions in challenging conditions. But Sarah could see that Rodriguez was focused primarily on the navigation aspects of the mission, the waypoints and altitude changes that would take them around the worst of the storm system. The technical aspects of aircraft performance in extreme weather seemed to be secondary considerations, details that would be handled through standard procedures and established protocols. Major Thompson, known as Iceman for his legendary calm under pressure, asked about fuel reserves and emergency landing options along the route. His questions were thorough and professional, reflecting the kind of systematic thinking that had made him one of the squadron's most reliable pilots. But Thompson's experience was primarily in fighter aircraft, where performance margins were significantly different from the heavy transport they would be flying. The Ka-130's characteristics in extreme weather conditions represented a knowledge gap that might not become apparent until they were already committed to the mission. Captain Sullivan, the youngest member of the team, but already recognized for his exceptional low-altitude navigation skills, studied the approach procedures for Glacier Bay Island. His ability to read terrain and adjust to changing conditions had earned him the Calcine Viper, but his experience was concentrated in clear weather operations where visibility and precise navigation were the primary challenges. The conditions they would encounter during the rescue mission would test skills that couldn't be learned in simulators or practiced during routine training flights. Webb concluded the briefing with an emphasis on safety protocols and abort criteria, the predetermined conditions that would force them to abandon the mission rather than risk the lives of the rescue crew. The parameters were conservative but realistic, acknowledging that there were limits to what could be accomplished even with the best equipment and most skilled personnel. But Sarah knew that once they were airborne and faced with the reality of people dying on an ice shelf, those carefully planned abort criteria would be tested against the human instinct to push forward. Despite increasing risks, the weather briefing that followed painted a picture of deteriorating conditions that would challenge even the most experienced crews. Meteorologist Captain Lisa Chun used satellite imagery and forecast models to show how the storm system was developing, highlighting areas of severe turbulence, icing conditions, and wind shear that would make flying extremely hazardous. The window for the mission was narrowing faster than originally predicted, with conditions expected to deteriorate below minimums within 6 hours. Every minute of delay reduced their chances of reaching the stranded research team before the weather made rescue impossible. Sarah watched the faces of the rescue crew as they absorbed the weather information, seeing the subtle signs of concern that experienced pilots learned to mask during mission briefings. Rodriguez's jaw tightened slightly as Chun described the icing conditions they would encounter, while Thompson's fingers drummed unconsciously against the table as he processed the wind speed forecasts. Sullivan remained focused on the meteorological charts, but Sarah could see him calculating distances and timing in his head, working through the mathematical precision that would be required to navigate safely through the deteriorating conditions. Medical briefing that followed added another layer of urgency to the mission. The research team had been exposed to extreme cold for over 36 hours, with 2 members showing signs of severe hypothermia that could prove fatal without immediate medical intervention. Dr. Patricia Reeves, the flight surgeon who would accompany the rescue team, outlined the medical procedures that would be required during extraction and transport. The research team would need to be stabilized and prepared for transport under conditions that were far from ideal, adding complexity to an already challenging operation. As the briefing concluded and the team began preparing for departure, Sarah noticed Lieutenant Colonel Webb reviewing the weight and balance calculations one more time. His expression showed the kind of focused concentration that indicated he was working through a problem, but the pressure of the mission timeline was clearly influencing his decision-making process. The calculations showed the aircraft would be operating at maximum gross weight, but they were technically within acceptable limits according to the flight manual specifications. What the manual didn't account for was how those specifications would translate to real-world performance in the extreme conditions they would encounter. Sarah moved closer to the planning table as the briefing room began to empty, her eyes scanning the mission documents that had been left behind. The flight plan showed a route that would take them north along the Alaska Peninsula before turning west toward the Aleutian Islands, following a path designed to avoid the worst of the storm system, while maintaining sufficient fuel reserves for the return flight. The timing was critical, with the entire operation dependent on reaching the research team during a narrow window when weather conditions would be marginal but still within acceptable limits for landing operations. The aircraft loading manifest confirmed what Sarah had observed during her earlier inspection of the C-130. Maximum fuel load, full medical equipment package, survival gear for extended operations in Arctic conditions, and provisions for 6 additional passengers who would likely be in various states of medical distress. The total weight would put the aircraft very close to its certified limits, leaving little margin for the kind of performance degradation that occurred in severe weather conditions. Captain Rodriguez approached the table where Sarah was standing, her flight suit already configured with survival gear and emergency equipment. Phoenix had a reputation for thorough mission preparation, and she was clearly using the remaining time to review details that might prove critical during the operation. But when she looked at Sarah, her expression carried the polite dismissal that came with rank and role distinctions. Ground support personnel were expected to maintain the aircraft, not question mission planning decisions made by qualified pilots. "The aircraft's ready for departure," Sarah said, keeping her voice neutral and professional. "All systems check normal, fuel load is complete, and the specialized equipment has been tested and verified." Rodriguez nodded acknowledgement, but didn't invite further conversation. The social dynamics of military aviation were clear and well established, with distinct boundaries between those who flew missions and those who supported them from the ground. Sarah had once been on the other side of that boundary, but her current status placed her firmly in the support category regardless of her experience or expertise. Major Thompson joined them at the planning table, his attention focused on the meteorological data that would guide their navigation decisions. Iceman's reputation for analytical thinking was evident in the way he studied the weather patterns, looking for trends and changes that might affect their mission profile. But his analysis was based on theoretical knowledge and simulator training, rather than the practical experience of flying heavy aircraft through severe weather systems. "The icing conditions look particularly challenging," Thompson observed, pointing to areas on the weather chart where ice accumulation rates were forecast to exceed normal aircraft capabilities. "We'll need to be careful about altitude selection to minimize exposure." Sarah could have mentioned that the anti-icing systems on the C-130 were effective but power-intensive, requiring careful management of electrical loads when operating at maximum weight. She could have explained that the aircraft's performance in icing conditions was significantly affected by weight and center of gravity, factors that weren't adequately addressed in standard training scenarios. But her role as ground support didn't include providing operational advice to qualified pilots. Regardless of her own experience and knowledge, Captain Sullivan studied the approach procedures for Glacier Bay Island, his finger tracing the descent profile that would take them from cruise altitude down to the ice shelf where the research team was stranded. Viper's skill at low-altitude navigation was exceptional, but the approach they were planning would be complicated by wind conditions and visibility restrictions that were unlike anything in his previous experience. The ice shelf landing site was essentially a frozen runway with no navigation aids, no lighting systems, and no margin for error in positioning or approach speed. The final mission authorization came through as the rescue team completed their preparations, transmitted from headquarters with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that reduced complex operational decisions to simple approval codes. The paperwork was complete, the crew was qualified, the aircraft was airworthy, and the mission fell within established parameters for risk and feasibility. But Sarah knew that paperwork and regulations couldn't account for the subtle factors that often determined mission success or failure, the kind of details that became critical when everything else went according to plan, except for the one variable that no one had properly considered. The rescue team moved toward the aircraft with the purposeful efficiency of professionals who had trained extensively for operations like this one. Their equipment was packed and secured, their procedures rehearsed and refined, their communication protocols established and tested. They were prepared for the mission as it had been planned and briefed, ready to execute their assigned roles within the parameters that had been established through careful analysis and systematic preparation. But as Sarah watched them board the C-130, she carried with her the knowledge that the mission they were preparing to fly was different from the mission they had planned. The weight and balance issues she had identified would affect aircraft performance in ways that hadn't been fully considered during the planning process. The extreme weather conditions would test the limits of both equipment and crew in ways that couldn't be replicated in training scenarios. And the narrow window for mission success was closing faster than anyone realized, compressed by a storm system that was developing more rapidly than the forecast models had predicted. The engines spooled up with the distinctive whine of turboprop aircraft preparing for departure, their sound echoing across the hangar as the C-130 prepared to taxi toward the active runway. Sarah stood near the operations building, watching the aircraft she had maintained and inspected carry a crew she respected toward a mission that would challenge everything they thought they knew about flying in extreme conditions. They were good pilots flying a well-maintained aircraft on a carefully planned mission, but they were also flying into conditions that would require knowledge and experience that couldn't be found in flight manuals or training programs. The radio chatter from the control tower confirmed that the rescue mission was cleared for immediate departure, with priority handling through all phases of flight operations. The C-130 moved slowly across the tarmac, its massive bulk giving no indication of the delicate balance between performance and weight that would determine its ability to complete the mission successfully. Sarah watched until the aircraft disappeared into the low clouds that marked the beginning of the storm system, carrying with it the hopes of 6 stranded researchers and the careers of 3 pilots, who had no idea what they were about to encounter. The first transmission from the rescue aircraft came through exactly 43 minutes after takeoff, Captain Rodriguez's voice crackling through the static that always accompanied long-range communications in deteriorating weather. Sarah stood in the maintenance bay, ostensibly checking inventory reports, but her attention was focused entirely on the radio mounted above the parts storage area. The quality of the transmission told her more than the words themselves. The slight distortion and intermittent fading indicated that atmospheric conditions were already affecting radio propagation, an early warning sign that the storm system was more intense than the forecast models had predicted. Elmendorf Control. Rescue 77, passing waypoint Alpha at flight level 240, encountering moderate turbulence and light icing conditions. Request descent to flight level 200 to avoid building weather ahead. Rodriguez's voice maintained the professional calm that was expected during routine flight operations, but Sarah could detect the subtle tension that came with flying an aircraft that wasn't responding quite as expected. The request for lower altitude suggested that the crew was already dealing with performance issues related to ice accumulation on the aircraft surfaces. The response from air traffic control came immediately, granting the requested altitude change while providing updated weather information that painted an increasingly challenging picture. Wind speeds along the planned route were higher than forecast, with gusts reaching nearly 50 knots at their cruise altitude. More significantly, the storm system was moving faster than predicted, compressing the time window for the rescue operation by at least an hour. What had been planned as a challenging but manageable mission was rapidly evolving into something that pushed beyond the normal parameters for safe operations. Sarah made her way to the meteorology office, where Captain Chun was monitoring real-time weather data from multiple sources. The satellite imagery displayed on the main screen showed a massive spiral of clouds stretching across the North Pacific, with the rescue aircraft represented as a small blip moving steadily northwest toward the heart of the developing storm. The contrast between the tiny aircraft icon and the enormous weather system surrounding it provided a sobering perspective on the scale of the challenge facing the rescue crew. The system's intensifying faster than any of our models predicted, Chun explained to the operations staff gathered around her workstation. We're seeing pressure drops that indicate the storm will reach major intensity within the next 4 hours, at least 6 hours ahead of schedule. The wind shear patterns are becoming more pronounced, and the icing levels are extending both higher and lower than originally forecast. The implications were clear to anyone with experience in aviation. Meteorology. The rescue aircraft was flying into conditions that were deteriorating in real time, with weather phenomena that could make flying extremely hazardous or impossible. The original mission plan had been based on intercepting the research team during a brief window of improved conditions, but that window was closing much faster than anyone had anticipated. Every minute of flight time was taking the crew deeper into a weather system that was becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood at the central command station, his expression reflecting the weight of responsibility that came with sending personnel into harm's way. The mission authorization had been based on specific weather forecasts and risk assessments, but those parameters were changing rapidly as the actual conditions evolved beyond the predicted scenarios. Webb faced the kind of decision that defined military leadership, whether to continue with a mission that was becoming more dangerous by the hour, or to abort and accept the loss of 6 civilian lives on a disintegrating ice shelf. The second transmission from the rescue aircraft came 90 minutes into the flight, with Captain Rodriguez reporting their position as they approached the most challenging portion of the route. Elmendorf Control, Rescue 77 is experiencing severe turbulence and moderate to heavy icing. Aircraft performance is degraded, but we're maintaining course toward the target area. Request updated weather at Glacier Bay Island. Sarah could hear the strain in Rodriguez's voice now, the careful control that pilots learn to maintain when dealing with conditions that tested both aircraft and crew capabilities. The mention of degraded performance confirmed what Sarah had suspected from the beginning. The aircraft was operating at maximum weight in conditions that demanded optimal performance characteristics. The C-130 was a robust and capable aircraft, but even the best engineering had limits when pushed beyond design specifications. The meteorological update that followed painted an even grimmer picture of conditions at the target location. Winds were gusting to 70 knots with embedded severe turbulence. Visibility was dropping rapidly due to blowing snow and ice crystals, and the temperature was falling toward levels that would make ground operations extremely hazardous for both the rescue crew and the stranded research team. The ice shelf where the researchers were trapped was reportedly breaking apart faster than satellite imagery could track, with large sections calving into the ocean at irregular intervals. Captain Chun's voice was professional but concerned as she transmitted the latest weather data to the rescue aircraft. Rescue 77. Current conditions at Glacier Bay Island show winds 270 at 6.5 gusting to 70 knots. Visibility 1/4 mile and blowing snow. Temperature -38 degrees Fahrenheit. Pressure is falling rapidly, and conditions are expected to deteriorate further within the next 2 hours. The weather report effectively meant that the rescue crew was flying toward a landing site, where conditions were already at the margins of what was considered feasible for aircraft operations. Landing a heavy transport aircraft on an ice shelf in 70-knot winds required precision and skill that went far beyond normal training scenarios. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, with any mistaken approach speed, alignment, or power management potentially resulting in catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. Sarah found herself drawn to the flight operations center, where duty officers were monitoring multiple communication channels and tracking the progress of the rescue mission. The large display screen showed the aircraft's position relative to the target area, with weather overlays that illustrated the PVA intensity of the storm system they were penetrating. The rescue aircraft appeared as a small icon moving steadily through areas marked in red and orange, indicating severe weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced crews. The radio communications from the aircraft became more frequent as they approached the target area, with updates on aircraft systems, weather conditions, and mission status transmitted at regular intervals. Major Thompson's voice joined the communications as the crew began preparing for the approach to Glacier Bay Island, his analytical mind working through the complex calculations required for landing in extreme conditions. Elmendorf Control, we're beginning our descent toward the target area. Aircraft systems are functioning within normal parameters, but we're experiencing significant ice accumulation on all surfaces. Performance is degraded by approximately 15% from normal specifications. Thompson's report was factual and professional, but it confirmed that the aircraft was operating outside the performance envelope that had been used for mission planning. The 15% performance degradation meant that landing distances would be longer, climb rates would be reduced, and the aircraft would be more susceptible to wind effects during critical phases of flight. On a standard runway with normal weather conditions, these factors would be manageable through established procedures and careful technique. But on an ice shelf with hurricane-force winds and zero visibility, the degraded performance could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a disaster that claimed even more lives. Dr. Reeves transmitted her medical assessment of the conditions they would encounter on the ground, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging operation. The research team is showing signs of severe exposure, with at least 2 individuals requiring immediate medical intervention. Ground time needs to be minimized to prevent further deterioration of their condition, but they'll need stabilization before transport. The medical requirements created a fundamental conflict with the operational constraints imposed by weather and aircraft performance. The research team needed time for medical stabilization, but every minute spent on the ground increased the risk of being trapped by deteriorating weather conditions. The ice shelf was breaking apart unpredictably, creating the possibility that the landing area could become unsuitable for takeoff. While the medical team was working to prepare their patients for transport, Captain Sullivan's voice joined the communications as the crew began their approach to the landing area, his expertise in low-altitude navigation becoming critical as visibility dropped to near zero. We have the beacon signal from the research team, but visual contact with the landing area is intermittent due to blowing snow, using radar altimeter and GPS for precision approach. The approach they were attempting had never been practiced. In conditions this severe, requiring skills and judgment that couldn't be taught in simulators or training programs, Sullivan was essentially creating the procedures as he flew, adapting standard techniques to deal with conditions that existed at the very edge of what was possible with current technology and human capability. The margin for error was measured in feet and seconds, with no opportunity for a second attempt if the first approach failed. The tension in the operations center was palpable as everyone listened to the communications from the rescue aircraft. The crew was committed to the approach now, too low on fuel to abort and return to base without attempting the rescue. They would land on the ice shelf and extract the research team, or they would become casualties themselves in the rapidly deteriorating conditions. There were no other options remaining as the storm system continued to intensify around them. Sarah stood near the communications console, her hands clenched unconsciously as she listened to the crew work through the most challenging approach of their careers. She could visualize every aspect of what they were experiencing: the aircraft bucking and shaking in the severe turbulence, ice building up on the windscreen faster than the de-icing systems could clear it, the constant battle to maintain precise control while being buffeted by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once. The final approach began with Sullivan calling out altitude and speed references while Rodriguez fought to maintain control of an aircraft that was being pushed to its absolute limits. The C-130 was designed for rough field operations, but nothing in its engineering specifications had anticipated landing on a breaking ice shelf and hurricane-force winds with maximum gross weight and degraded performance due to ice accumulation. 500 feet. Approach speed stable. Winds variable at 6.5 gusting to 7.5 knots from the west-northwest. Sullivan's voice was steady despite the impossible conditions they were flying through. 400 feet. Still have beacon contact. No visual on the landing area. The final moments of the approach would determine whether the rescue mission succeeded or failed, whether 6 stranded researchers would be saved or whether the rescue crew would join them as casualties of conditions that had exceeded every planning assumption and safety margin. Sarah found herself holding her breath as the communications continued, knowing that everything depended on skills and luck that couldn't be guaranteed under any circumstances. The storm was winning, and everyone in the operations center knew it. The rescue crew was flying an aircraft that was being pushed beyond its design limits toward a landing site that might not exist by the time they reached it, all in service of a mission that had seemed difficult but achievable just hours earlier. The difference between heroism and tragedy was measured in wind speeds and ice accumulation rates that couldn't be controlled by any human agency. The transmission that changed everything came at 1400 hours. Captain Rodriguez's voice, cutting through the static with an edge that made everyone in the operations center freeze. Elmendorf Control, Rescue 77 declaring emergency. We've encountered severe icing beyond aircraft capabilities. Unable to maintain altitude. Descending through flight level 180 and continuing to lose performance. Ice accumulation is overwhelming all de-icing systems. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the implications of Rodriguez's report became clear. The C-130's anti-icing systems were among the most advanced available, designed to handle conditions that would ground most other aircraft. If those systems were being overwhelmed, it meant the crew was flying through weather conditions that exceeded the engineering specifications of even the most robust military transport aircraft. The weight penalty they were carrying was now becoming a critical factor as the aircraft struggled to maintain sufficient power to overcome the drag created by ice accumulation. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's response was immediate and professional, but Sarah could hear the concern underlying his carefully controlled tone. Rescue 77, understand you're declaring emergency due to severe icing. What are your intentions? The question carried enormous weight. whether the crew would attempt to continue toward the rescue site or turn back toward the relative safety of Elmendorf Air Force Base. Either choice carried significant risks, with no guarantee that the aircraft could maintain flight in the deteriorating conditions. The weather briefing that followed painted a picture of an atmospheric phenomenon that was developing faster and more intensely than any forecast model had predicted. Captain Chun's voice was tight with professional frustration as she transmitted updated conditions that showed the storm system had essentially exploded into a major weather event. Rescue 77, we're tracking a rapid intensification event. The low pressure center has deepened by 40 millibars in the past 6 hours, with associated wind speeds increasing to hurricane force across your entire route of flight. Meteorological explanation meant that the rescue crew was trapped inside a weather system that was behaving unlike anything in the historical record for that region. Rapid intensification events were more commonly associated with tropical hurricanes, but the same atmospheric dynamics were now occurring in the Arctic environment, where temperature differentials and jet stream interactions could create equally devastating conditions. The storm had essentially become a winter hurricane, with wind speeds and pressure gradients that made flying extremely hazardous for any aircraft. Major Thompson's voice joined the communications as the crew worked through emergency procedures designed for aircraft experiencing severe icing conditions. We're cycling through all anti-icing systems, but ice accumulation is exceeding removal capacity. Airspeed is decreasing despite maximum power settings, and we're experiencing control surface sluggishness consistent with heavy ice loading. Sarah could visualize exactly what Thompson was describing: ice building up on the aircraft's wings, propellers, and control surfaces faster than the heating systems could melt it away. The C-130's turboprop engines were particularly susceptible to ice ingestion, which could cause power loss or complete engine failure if ice chunks were shed from the propeller blades. The aircraft was essentially fighting a losing battle against atmospheric conditions that were designed by nature to bring down anything that attempted to fly through them. The Flight Operations Center became a hub of urgent activity as personnel worked to provide support for the emergency situation. Alternative landing sites were identified and evaluated. Fuel consumption was recalculated based on the aircraft's degraded performance, and emergency response teams were alerted at multiple locations along potential diversion routes. But all of these efforts were constrained by the fundamental reality that the rescue aircraft was operating in conditions that made normal emergency procedures inadequate or impossible. Captain Sullivan's navigation expertise became critical as the crew attempted to find a route through the storm system that would allow them to reach an alternate landing site. We're showing multiple areas of severe weather on all available routes. The storm system has expanded beyond our fuel range. For circumnavigation, we need to find a way through or we'll be forced to attempt landing in current conditions. The navigation challenge was unprecedented. The storm system had grown to cover an area larger than most states, with embedded severe weather that extended from surface level to altitudes well above the C-130's operational ceiling. Traditional storm avoidance techniques required flying around dangerous weather, but the scope of this system made that impossible given the aircraft's current fuel state and degraded performance. They would have to find a path through the storm, or accept the consequences of attempting to land in conditions that exceeded all safety parameters. Dr. Reeves transmitted her assessment of the medical situation aboard the aircraft, adding another dimension to the emergency they were facing. We're experiencing severe turbulence that's making it impossible to provide adequate medical care. The crew is showing signs of fatigue and stress that could affect decision-making capabilities. We need to get this aircraft on the ground as soon as possible. The medical factors created additional pressure on an already critical situation. Prolonged exposure to severe turbulence and high-stress conditions could degrade crew performance at exactly the moment when peak capability was most needed. The physiological effects of fighting severe weather for extended periods were well documented. Decreased reaction times, impaired judgment, and reduced manual dexterity that could prove catastrophic during critical phases of flight operation. Second emergency declaration came 30 minutes later, with Rodriguez's voice carrying the strain that indicated the situation was continuing to deteriorate. Elmendorf Control, Rescue 77 updating emergency status. We've lost number 3 engine due to ice ingestion. Operating on 3 engines with continued severe icing and turbulence. Fuel state is becoming critical for any diversion options. The loss of an engine in severe weather conditions transformed the emergency from serious to potentially catastrophic. The C-130 was designed to operate safely on 3 engines under normal conditions, but severe icing and maximum gross weight created performance demands that pushed the remaining engines beyond their normal operating parameters. The combination of reduced power and increased drag from ice accumulation meant that the aircraft might not be able to maintain altitude indefinitely. Sarah found herself moving closer to the communications console, her experience telling her that the situation was evolving beyond the scope of standard emergency procedures. The crew was dealing with multiple simultaneous failures in conditions that made normal recovery techniques ineffective. Engine failure, severe icing, degraded performance, critical fuel state, and deteriorating weather all combined to create a scenario that wasn't covered in any training manual or emergency checklist. Captain Chun updated the weather information with increasingly dire forecasts that showed the storm system continuing to intensify. Rescue 77, latest analysis shows the low pressure center has deepened another 15 millibars. Surface winds are now sustained at 80 knots with gusts over 100 knots. All airports within your fuel range are reporting conditions below emergency minimums. The weather update meant that the crew was facing a situation where all available landing options were compromised by conditions that exceeded the design limits of both aircraft and airport facilities. Attempting to land in 100-knot winds was essentially impossible for any aircraft, let alone one that was already compromised by ice accumulation and engine failure. The storm had effectively trapped them in an aerial environment that was becoming increasingly hostile with each passing minute. Major Thompson's voice returned to the communications with a report that confirmed everyone's worst fears about the aircraft's condition. We're unable to maintain our assigned altitude. Rate of descent is increasing despite maximum power on remaining engines. Ice accumulation appears to be affecting lift characteristics across the entire wing surface. The flight characteristics Thompson described indicated that the aircraft was approaching aerodynamic stall conditions caused by ice distorting the wing's ability to generate lift. This was one of the most dangerous situations possible in aviation. An aircraft that was literally being transformed into an unflyable object by atmospheric conditions beyond human control. Recovery required techniques that might not be effective given the extreme nature of the icing they were experiencing. Lieutenant Colonel Webb's response reflected the gravity of a situation that was moving beyond conventional solutions. Rescue 77, we're coordinating with all available resources for emergency assistance. Continue to advise your status and intentions as conditions permit. The carefully worded response acknowledged that the crew was facing circumstances where standard emergency support might not be adequate. The storm system had created conditions that challenged not just the aircraft and crew, but the entire support infrastructure that normally provided backup for military operations. Weather conditions at potential diversion airfields, communication difficulties caused by atmospheric disturbance, and the sheer scope of the emergency were overwhelming normal response capabilities. Captain Sullivan's navigation updates painted a picture of an aircraft running out of options as fuel consumption increased and performance continued to degrade. All diversion airports are reporting winds above aircraft limitations. were calculating fuel exhaustion before reaching any suitable landing site, given current consumption rates and aircraft performance. The navigation assessment was essentially a death sentence unless something changed dramatically in their favor. The aircraft was consuming fuel at rates that exceeded normal specifications due to the power required to fight severe weather with reduced engine capability. Meanwhile, every potential landing site was reporting weather conditions that made landing extremely hazardous or impossible. They were trapped in an aerial environment that was becoming more hostile by the minute. The communications from the rescue aircraft became more fragmented as atmospheric conditions continued to interfere with radio propagation. Static and interference made it difficult to maintain clear contact with the crew, adding another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation. The operations center personnel found themselves straining to understand transmissions that carried critical information about the aircraft's status and the crew's decision-making process. Dr. Reeves provided updates on crew condition that added psychological factors to the already overwhelming list of challenges they were facing. Crew fatigue is becoming a significant factor. We've been fighting severe weather for over 4 hours, and the stress is beginning to affect performance. Physical exhaustion, combined with the sustained adrenaline response, is creating conditions where mistakes become more likely. The human factors assessment confirmed what everyone in the operations center already understood. The crew was being pushed beyond normal endurance limits by conditions that demanded peak performance for extended periods. The margin for error was disappearing, not just because of mechanical and weather factors, but because human beings had limits that couldn't be exceeded indefinitely, regardless of training or motivation. The final transmission before radio contact was temporarily lost came with Rodriguez's voice, barely audible through the static and interference. Elmendorf Control, Rescue 77, is severe turbulence and continued descent. We're going to attempt emergency procedures for recovery. Will advise when able. The broken transmission left everyone in the operations center staring at silent radios, knowing that somewhere in the Arctic storm system, 3 highly trained pilots were fighting for their lives in an aircraft that was being pushed beyond every design specification and safety margin. The rescue mission that had begun as a challenging but achievable operation had become a test of human skill against natural forces that recognize no authority except the fundamental laws of physics and aerodynamics. The silence that followed was filled with the knowledge that conventional approaches had failed, that standard procedures were inadequate, and that the crew of Rescue 77 was facing circumstances that exceeded every planning assumption and emergency contingency. The storm had won the first round, leaving everyone to wonder whether human skill and determination would be enough to prevent a tragedy that was developing in real time above the frozen Arctic landscape. Sarah stood in the communications room, listening to the static-filled silence that had replaced the steady stream of updates from Rescue 77, her mind processing information that everyone else seemed to be missing. The broken transmission had mentioned emergency procedures for recovery, but she knew the standard procedures for severe icing conditions wouldn't be effective given the aircraft's current configuration and the extreme nature of the weather they were encountering. The crew was attempting solutions that had been designed for different circumstances, applying textbook responses to a situation that existed far outside the parameters of normal training scenarios. The weight and balance issues she had identified during her pre-flight inspection were now becoming critical factors in the aircraft's ability to recover from the emergency conditions. Operating at maximum gross weight meant that the C-130's center of gravity was at the aft limit of acceptable range, making the aircraft more susceptible to aerodynamic stall and more difficult to control during recovery maneuvers. The standard emergency procedures assumed normal weight distribution and performance, characteristics that simply didn't exist in their current situation. Lieutenant Colonel Webb coordinated emergency response efforts from the command center, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the gravity of the situation unfolding. All stations, we have a missing aircraft with souls on board, operating in severe weather conditions. Initiate full search and rescue protocols for the Arctic region. Coordinate with Coast Guard and civilian authorities for any available assets in the area. But Sarah knew that search and rescue operations would be impossible in current weather conditions, with visibility near zero and winds that would ground any aircraft capable of conducting aerial searches. The storm system had created an environment where normal emergency response capabilities were ineffective, leaving the crew of Rescue 77 to resolve their situation without external assistance. They were alone in conditions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of aviation safety and emergency management. Captain Chun updated the meteorological analysis with data that showed the storm system continuing to intensify beyond all forecast predictions. The rapid intensification is showing no signs of abating. We're now tracking wind speeds of over 100 knots with embedded severe turbulence extending from surface level to flight level 300. The system has characteristics of both a nor'easter and a polar cyclone, creating conditions we've never observed in this region. The weather phenomenon they were dealing with was essentially unprecedented, combining atmospheric dynamics that created perfect conditions for aircraft icing, severe turbulence, and winds that exceeded the operational limits of virtually every aircraft type. The crew was fighting not just bad weather, but a meteorological event that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in Arctic aviation. Their training and experience, while extensive, hadn't prepared them for conditions that existed outside the realm of historical precedent. Sarah walked to the meteorological station, where weather radar displays showed the massive storm system as a swirling mass of red and purple, echoes indicating extreme precipitation and turbulence intensity. The rescue aircraft's last known position placed them in the center of the most intense portion of the storm, where atmospheric conditions were most severe and least predictable. The radar imagery revealed structures within the storm that resembled the eye wall formations typically associated with tropical hurricanes, but occurring in Arctic conditions where such phenomena weren't supposed to exist. The technical aspects of what the crew was experiencing became clearer as Sarah studied the weather data with the knowledge of someone who understood both meteorology and aircraft performance characteristics. The combination of severe icing, turbulence, and wind shear was creating a situation where standard recovery techniques might actually make the aircraft's condition worse rather than better. The procedures they were attempting were designed for single threat scenarios, not the multiple simultaneous challenges they were facing. Dr. Patricia Reeves had been monitoring crew communications before radio contact was lost, providing insights into the human factors that were affecting the situation. The stress levels we observed in their voice communications indicate that crew fatigue is becoming a significant factor. They've been dealing with emergency conditions for over 4 hours, which exceeds normal human performance limits for sustained high-stress operations. The physiological reality was that even the most highly trained pilots had limits to their endurance and decision-making capability under extreme stress. The crew had been fighting severe weather for longer than most training scenarios lasted, burning through mental and physical reserves that couldn't be replenished while dealing with ongoing emergencies. Their judgment and reaction times were likely degraded at the exact moment when peak performance was most critical for survival. Sarah found herself analyzing the situation from perspectives that the official emergency response wasn't considering. Her experience with aircraft systems and maintenance gave her insights into how the C-130 would behave under the extreme conditions described in the crew's transmissions. The ice accumulation wasn't just affecting lift and drag characteristics, it was also adding significant weight to an aircraft that was already operating at maximum gross weight limits. the additional weight from ice accumulation would shift the aircraft's center of gravity even further aft, making it more prone to aerodynamic instability and reducing the effectiveness of control surface inputs. The crew would be fighting an aircraft that was becoming progressively more difficult to control as ice continued to accumulate faster than the de-icing systems could remove it. Their training had prepared them for icing encounters, but not for icing of this magnitude, combined with the other factors they were facing. Captain Rodriguez had mentioned losing the number 3 engine to ice ingestion, but Sarah realized that the implications extended beyond just reduced power output. The Co-130's engines were mounted on the wings in a configuration that affected the aircraft's lateral balance when one engine failed. With maximum fuel load and aft center of gravity, the asymmetric thrust condition would create control challenges that were compounded by the ice accumulation affecting control surface effectiveness. The emergency checklist procedures for engine failure assumed normal weight and balance conditions, clear weather for visual reference, and the ability to maintain controlled flight while working through recovery procedures. None of those assumptions applied to the situation Rescue 77 was facing. They were attempting to manage engine failure in conditions that made visual flight impossible, with an aircraft configuration that magnified every control input and reduced the margin for error to essentially zero. Major Thompson's earlier reports about control surface sluggishness indicated that ice was affecting not just the wings and engines, but the entire flight control system. The C-130 used cable-operated flight controls that could become less responsive as ice accumulated on hinges and control surface gaps. The crew would be working harder to achieve the same control responses, adding physical fatigue to the mental stress they were already experiencing. Sarah walked to the aircraft technical library where maintenance manuals contained detailed information about C-130 performance in extreme conditions. The data she found confirmed her suspicions about how the aircraft would behave under the conditions the crew was experiencing. The performance charts showed dramatic reductions in climb capability and increased stall speeds when operating with ice accumulation, particularly at maximum gross weight. The emergency recovery procedures outlined in the technical manuals assumed that crews would be able to descend to warmer altitudes where ice would sublimate naturally, but the storm system extended from surface level to well above the aircraft's service ceiling. There was no altitude where they could escape the icing conditions, meaning that traditional recovery techniques would be ineffective or impossible to execute. The fuel consumption data revealed another critical factor that might not be apparent to the crew in their current situation. Fighting severe weather with reduced engine power would increase fuel consumption well beyond normal specifications, but the exact rate would depend on factors that couldn't be calculated precisely during flight operations. They might be burning fuel faster than they realized, reducing their options for diversion or extended maneuvering. Captain Sullivan's navigation expertise would be critical in their current situation, but Sarah recognized that his skills were being challenged by conditions that exceeded normal navigation scenarios. GPS systems could be affected by severe weather, radar altimeters could give erratic readings over water and ice, and visual navigation was impossible in zero visibility conditions. The crew was essentially flying blind through a three-dimensional maze of severe weather phenomena. The communication difficulties they were experiencing added another layer of complexity to emergency management. Without reliable radio contact, the crew couldn't receive updated weather information, coordinate with emergency services, or request assistance from other aircraft that might be in the area. They were isolated in an environment that was becoming more hostile by the minute, forced to make critical decisions based on incomplete information. Sarah realized that the crew's situation was complicated by factors that weren't being addressed in the emergency response efforts. The standard procedures being coordinated from the operations center assumed that the aircraft would either recover from its emergency condition, or crash in a location where search and rescue operations could be conducted. But the unique nature of the storm system created a third possibility, that the aircraft could survive the immediate emergency, but become trapped in conditions that made rescue impossible. The ice shelf where the original research team was stranded had been breaking apart for days, creating a dynamic environment where landing sites could disappear or become unsuitable between the time they were identified and when aircraft arrived. If Rescue 77 managed to reach an emergency landing site, they might find conditions that had changed dramatically since their last weather update. The operations center continued coordinating response efforts, but Sarah could see that the standard emergency procedures weren't adequate for the unique circumstances they were facing. Coast Guard assets were grounded by weather conditions, civilian aircraft were prohibited from operating in the affected area, and military resources were limited by the same atmospheric conditions that had trapped Rescue 77 in the first place. The reality was becoming clear that if the crew of Rescue 77 was going to survive, they would have to solve their problems without external assistance. The storm system had created an environment where normal support systems were ineffective, where standard procedures didn't apply, and where survival depended entirely on the skills and knowledge of 3 pilots who were being pushed far beyond the limits of normal human endurance. Sarah stood in the communications room, surrounded by people who were doing everything possible within the constraints of established procedures and available resources. But she knew that everything possible wasn't going to be enough unless someone recognized that this situation required solutions that existed outside the realm of normal emergency response. The crew needed information and guidance that could only come from someone who understood the specific technical factors that were affecting their aircraft's performance in these unprecedented conditions. The silence from Rescue 77 stretched longer, filled with static and atmospheric interference that made clear communication impossible even when the crew was able to transmit. Somewhere in the Arctic storm system, 3 highly trained professionals were fighting for their lives in an aircraft that was being pushed beyond every design specification and safety margin. The question wasn't whether they had the skills to survive. It was whether anyone could provide them with the information they needed to apply those skills effectively. The moment of decision came when Sarah realized that no one else in the operations center understood the specific technical factors that were killing Rescue 77. She had been standing silently for over an hour, watching emergency response personnel coordinate efforts that were fundamentally inadequate for the unique circumstances the crew was facing. The standard procedures, while professionally executed, were based on assumptions that didn't apply to an aircraft operating at maximum gross weight in unprecedented weather conditions with multiple simultaneous system failures. Sarah stepped forward to the communications console where Lieutenant Colonel Webb was coordinating search and rescue efforts, her movement deliberate and purposeful. The conversations around her continued at the urgent pace of emergency operations, but she had moved beyond the role of silent observer into something else entirely. Her years of maintaining C-130 aircraft, studying their performance characteristics, and understanding their behavior in extreme conditions had prepared her for this moment, even though she had never imagined it would come. "Colonel Webb," she said, her voice cutting through the operational chatter with quiet authority. "I need to speak with Rescue 77 directly. There are technical factors affecting their aircraft performance that aren't being addressed in the standard emergency procedures." Webb turned toward her with the kind of expression that senior officers reserve for subordinates who had overstepped their boundaries. The social dynamics of military hierarchy were clear and well established, with distinct lines between those who made operational decisions and those who provided technical support. Ground maintenance personnel didn't interrupt emergency operations to offer advice to qualified pilots, regardless of their experience or knowledge. Martinez, this is an active emergency situation being handled by qualified personnel. I understand your concern, but the crew has access to all standard emergency procedures and technical support through normal channels. Webb's response was professional but dismissive, the kind of polite rejection that acknowledged her input while making it clear that her participation wasn't welcome or appropriate. But Sarah had moved beyond caring about protocol or hierarchy. She could see in the weather data and technical specifications exactly what was happening to the aircraft, could visualize the specific performance degradation that was making standard recovery techniques ineffective. The crew was fighting aircraft that was behaving unlike anything in their training experience, applying solutions that might actually be making their situation worse rather than better. The aircraft is operating at maximum gross weight with severe ice accumulation that's affecting both performance and control characteristics. Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. The center of gravity is shifting aft as ice accumulates, making the aircraft more prone to aerodynamic stall and reducing the effectiveness of standard recovery procedures. They need specific guidance for heavyweight icing recovery that isn't covered in normal emergency checklists. Captain Chun looked up from her meteorological displays, her expression showing recognition that Sarah was describing technical factors that hadn't been considered in the emergency response planning. The weather conditions were unprecedented, but the aircraft's response to those conditions was governed by aerodynamic principles that could be understood and addressed if the right information was available to the crew. Webb's expression shifted slightly as he processed the technical details Sarah was providing. His experience as a pilot told him that she was describing real factors that could affect aircraft performance, but his position as mission commander required him to maintain established procedures and chain of command. The emergency response was being conducted according to protocols that had been developed through years of experience and regulatory oversight. The crew has access to technical support through flight operations and maintenance channels, Webb replied, but his tone carried less certainty than before. All emergency procedures are being coordinated through proper channels with qualified personnel providing guidance as needed. Sarah realized that she was facing the same kind of institutional resistance that had grounded her from flying operations. The system valued credentials and authority over knowledge and experience, preferring established procedures over innovative solutions, even when those procedures were proving inadequate. But lives were at stake, and she had information that could make the difference between survival and tragedy. The proper channels don't include anyone who understands heavyweight icing characteristics in extreme weather conditions, Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made everyone in the communications room pause. I've spent 3 years studying retrofit specifications and performance modifications for C-130 aircraft operating in extreme conditions. The crew needs information that isn't available through normal support channels. Major Thompson had been monitoring emergency frequencies for any transmission from Rescue 77, but he looked up as Sarah spoke with growing recognition that she was describing technical factors that could be critical to the crew's survival. His own experience in emergency situations told him that sometimes survival depended on information and guidance that existed outside normal operational procedures. Dr. Greaves stepped closer to the communications console, her medical background giving her perspective on decision-making under extreme stress conditions. If the crew is dealing with technical factors that aren't covered in their training, they need access to expertise, regardless of where that expertise comes from. Lives take precedence over protocol. The comment created a moment of silence in the operations center as everyone processed the implications of what was being discussed. Emergency situations sometimes required decisions that existed outside normal hierarchies and procedures, but those decisions carried risks and responsibilities that extended far beyond the immediate crisis. Webb faced the choice between maintaining established protocols and authorizing actions that had no precedent in military emergency response. Sarah used the moment of uncertainty to press her case with specific technical details that demonstrated her understanding of the situation. The ice accumulation is adding approximately 2,000 pounds of weight to an aircraft already operating at maximum gross weight. That shifts the center of gravity 6 inches aft of normal limits, reducing elevator authority and increasing stall speeds by 15 to 20 knots. Standard recovery procedures assume normal weight and balance conditions that don't exist in their current situation. The technical precision of her analysis was impossible to dismiss, describing factors that could be verified through aircraft performance manuals and engineering specifications. Captain Chun nodded as Sarah spoke, recognizing that the meteorological conditions she was tracking would indeed create the aircraft performance effects being described. The combination of severe icing and maximum weight was pushing the C-130 into a flight regime that existed outside normal operational experience. Captain Sullivan, monitoring from the navigation station, looked up with an expression that showed recognition of the problem Sarah was describing. Heavyweight icing recovery isn't something we train for regularly. Most of our emergency procedures assume either normal weight or normal weather conditions, not both factors simultaneously. The admission created an opening that Sarah moved to fill with specific recommendations that could help the crew address their unique situation. They need to know that standard stall recovery techniques won't work with their current weight and balance. They'll need higher airspeeds for effective control response, and power management will be critical because they can't afford to lose any more altitude. Webb found himself in the position of making a decision that had no precedent in his experience. As a military commander, the emergency response protocols were clear and had been developed through extensive analysis of aviation accidents and incidents. But those protocols assumed circumstances that fit within normal parameters, and the situation facing Rescue 77 was clearly outside the realm of normal emergency scenarios. What specific guidance do you think they need? Webb asked, his question acknowledging that Sarah's technical knowledge might be relevant to the crew's survival without fully committing to allowing her direct communication with the aircraft. Sarah realized that this was her opportunity to provide information that could save lives, but she also understood that she would have only one chance to convince Webb that her guidance was necessary. The crew was fighting for survival in conditions that exceeded their training and experience, but they were also professionals who would be skeptical of advice from someone who wasn't authorized to provide operational guidance. They need to understand that their aircraft is behaving differently from anything in their experience, Sarah said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had studied these exact scenarios. Ice accumulation at maximum weight creates a spiral of degrading performance that can't be stopped with standard procedures. They need specific techniques for maintaining control and specific guidance for power management that accounts for their reduced engine capability. The radio crackled with static and interference, followed by a faint transmission that might have been from Rescue 77 attempting to re-establish communication. The sound galvanized everyone in the operations center, reminding them that real people were fighting for their lives while administrative discussions continued on the ground. Thompson moved to the communications console and began attempting to establish contact with the missing aircraft, his efforts hampered by atmospheric interference that made clear communication nearly impossible. The few words that came through were fragmented and distorted, but they carried the unmistakable sound of a crew dealing with an emergency situation that was continuing to deteriorate. Sarah stepped closer to the radio equipment, her decision made regardless of authorization or protocol. She had spent her entire career preparing for moments when technical knowledge could make the difference between success and failure, between life and death. The crew of Rescue 77 needed information that she possessed, and she was not going to let hierarchy and procedure prevent her from providing that information. Rescue 77. This is Elmendorf ground control with urgent technical guidance for heavyweight icing recovery. She transmitted, her voice cutting through the static with clarity and authority. Your aircraft performance is degraded by factors not covered in standard emergency procedures. Do you copy? The transmission represented a fundamental breach of protocol that could result in disciplinary action or worse. But Sarah had moved beyond caring about personal consequences. 3 lives hung in the balance, and she possessed knowledge that could help them survive conditions that had defeated every conventional approach. The moment of decision had passed, and she was now committed to a course of action that would either save lives or destroy her career. The response from Webb was immediate and sharp, his voice carrying the authority of command and the anger of someone whose orders had been directly disobeyed. Martinez, step away from that radio immediately. You are not authorized for direct communication with operational aircraft. But Sarah remained at the communications console, her hand steady on the microphone as she waited for a response from Rescue 77. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, taken action that placed her outside the protection of normal military hierarchy and procedure. Everything depended now on whether the crew would accept guidance from someone they didn't know, someone whose credentials existed in knowledge rather than rank. The response from Rescue 77 came through the static like a lifeline thrown across an ocean of white noise and atmospheric interference. Captain Rodriguez's voice was strained and barely audible, but the desperation in her tone made every word crystal clear to everyone listening in the operations center. Any station, this is Rescue 77 experiencing continued emergency. Aircraft performance is critically degraded, unable to maintain altitude, and standard recovery procedures are ineffective. We need immediate technical assistance. Sarah keyed the microphone before anyone could stop her, her voice cutting through the chaos with the kind of calm authority that came from absolute certainty about what needed to be done. Rescue 77. This is Technical Specialist Martinez. At Elmendorf, I understand you're dealing with severe icing at maximum gross weight. Your aircraft is behaving differently from normal parameters because ice accumulation is shifting your center of gravity aft while adding significant weight. Standard stall recovery procedures will not be effective in your current configuration. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, filled with static and the sound of atmospheric interference that made communication nearly impossible. Sarah could feel the weight of every eye in the operations center focused on her, but her attention remained fixed entirely on the radio and the crew that was fighting for survival somewhere in the Arctic storm system. Lieutenant Colonel Webb moved toward the communications console with an expression that promised immediate and severe consequences for her unauthorized transmission. But Dr. Reeves stepped between them with the quiet authority of someone whose medical training had taught her to prioritize life over protocol. Let her continue, the flight surgeon said simply. They need help that exists outside normal procedures. Rodriguez's response came back fragmented by interference, but carrying unmistakable relief at finally having contact with someone who understood their specific situation. Technical Specialist Martinez, we copy your transmission. Aircraft is nearly uncontrollable. Ice accumulation is severe on all surfaces, and we've lost significant altitude despite maximum power on remaining engines. What guidance can you provide? Sarah's mind raced through the technical calculations that would determine whether the crew could recover from their current situation. The Co-130's performance characteristics at maximum gross weight with severe ice accumulation created a narrow envelope of controllable flight that required precise technique and perfect execution. Any mistake in power management, airspeed control, or attitude adjustment could result in aerodynamic stall or loss of control. That would be impossible to recover from in their current configuration. Rescue 77. Your minimum controllable airspeed is now approximately 30 knots higher than normal due to ice contamination and weight. You need to maintain at least 140 knots indicated airspeed to retain effective control. Authority. Do not attempt aggressive control inputs. Ice accumulation has reduced your control surface effectiveness and made the aircraft more sensitive to pitch changes. The guidance Sarah was providing came from years of studying aircraft performance data and maintenance manuals that most pilots never bothered to read in detail. The specific numbers she was citing could be found in technical publications, but they were buried in performance charts and emergency procedures that assumed someone would have time to calculate precise values during normal operations. In the middle of a severe weather emergency, those calculations had to be done from memory and experience. Major Thompson's voice joined the communications with questions that showed the crew was beginning to understand the technical factors that were affecting their aircraft's behavior. Technical specialist Martinez were showing unusual control responses during power changes. When we increase power, the aircraft wants to pitch up more aggressively than normal, and when we reduce power, we get rapid sink rates that are difficult to arrest. Sarah nodded at the radio even though Thompson couldn't see her, recognizing the symptoms he was describing as classic indicators of aft center of gravity conditions combined with altered aerodynamic characteristics from ice contamination. Rescue 77. That's exactly what I would expect with your current configuration. The ice accumulation has moved your center of gravity aft of normal limits, making the aircraft more sensitive to power changes. You need to make very small power adjustments and allow more time for the aircraft to stabilize before making additional inputs. The technical discussion was taking place against a background of static and interference that made every word precious and every pause agonizing. Sarah could visualize the crew working in the cockpit of an aircraft that was fighting them with every control input, their training and experience challenged by conditions that existed outside the parameters of normal flight operations. They were learning to fly their aircraft all over again, discovering new limitations and characteristics in real time, while dealing with weather conditions that would challenge even a perfectly functioning aircraft. Captain Sullivan's navigation expertise became critical as he reported their position relative to potential emergency landing sites. Technical specialist Martinez, we're currently about 200 nautical miles southwest of our original destination, but we've been unable to maintain our planned altitude and heading due to aircraft control difficulties. Are there any airports within our range that might have better weather conditions? Sarah had been monitoring the meteorological data that Captain Chen was updating continuously, and she knew that the storm system had expanded to cover virtually every potential landing site within the aircraft's remaining fuel range. Rescue 77. I'm looking at current weather data, and unfortunately all airports within your fuel envelope are reporting conditions below landing minimums. However, there may be options for emergency landing sites that don't require full airport facilities. The suggestion opened up possibilities that hadn't been considered in normal emergency planning. Military aircraft were capable of landing on rough surfaces and improvised runways that wouldn't be suitable for civilian operations. But those capabilities were rarely tested under extreme weather conditions with compromised aircraft performance. Sarah was essentially suggesting that the crew consider options that existed at the very edge of what was possible with their aircraft type. Dr. Reeves provided medical input that added urgency to the decision-making process. Rescue 77, this is Dr. Reeves. How is crew condition? Are you experiencing fatigue or physical effects from the extended emergency situation? Rodriguez's response revealed the human factors that were becoming as critical as the technical challenges they were facing. Dr. Reeves, crew fatigue is significant. We've been fighting severe weather for over 5 hours now, and the physical demands of controlling this aircraft in current conditions are extreme. Muscle fatigue is affecting fine motor control, and decision-making is becoming more difficult. The medical assessment confirmed what Sarah had suspected about the physiological effects of prolonged exposure to extreme stress and physical demands. The crew was operating at the limits of human endurance, fighting an aircraft that required maximum effort for every control input while making life or death decisions under conditions that challenged their training and experience. Fatigue would make them more prone to errors at exactly the moment when precision was most critical. Sarah keyed the microphone with guidance that addressed both the technical and human factors affecting the crew's situation. Rescue 77. Given crew fatigue and aircraft condition, I recommend you begin looking for emergency landing options, rather than continuing to fight weather conditions that are likely to get worse. Your aircraft performance will continue to degrade as ice accumulation increases, and crew effectiveness will decrease with continued exposure to high-stress conditions. The recommendation represented a fundamental shift from attempting to complete the original rescue mission to focusing entirely on survival of the rescue crew. It was a decision that would normally be made by mission commanders based on risk assessments and operational priorities, but the unique circumstances had placed that decision-making authority in the hands of 3 exhausted pilots flying an Kozlov aircraft that was barely controllable. Thompson responded with information that showed the crew was already considering alternatives to conventional airport landings. Technical specialist Martinez were showing several frozen lakes in our area that might be suitable for emergency landing. The surfaces should be solid enough to support aircraft weight, and the flat terrain would give us better options for approach and landing. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she realized that Thompson was describing landing scenarios that existed well outside normal emergency procedures. Landing a C-130 on a frozen lake required precise judgment about ice thickness, surface conditions, and approach techniques that weren't covered in any training manual. The risks were enormous, but they might be the only option remaining for a crew that was running out of time, fuel, and alternatives. Rescue 77. Frozen lake landings are possible with your aircraft type, but you'll need to be extremely careful about surface evaluation and approach techniques. Ice thickness needs to be at least 4 feet for safe operations with your current weight, and you'll need to check for pressure ridges or rough areas that could damage the landing gear. The guidance Sarah was providing came from her knowledge of C-130 operations in extreme environments, but it was being applied to a situation that pushed beyond anything in normal operational experience. She was essentially teaching the crew how to perform experimental flight operations while they were fighting to maintain control of a compromised aircraft in severe weather conditions. Captain Chun provided meteorological support that could help the crew evaluate potential landing sites. Rescue 77. On showing several large lakes in your area with surface temperatures that should support solid ice formation. The wind conditions over land surfaces may be less severe than over open water, which could improve your landing options. The weather information added a crucial element to the decision-making process, but it also highlighted the fact that they were moving into uncharted territory, where normal safety procedures and risk assessments didn't apply. The crew would be making judgments about ice conditions and surface suitability based on visual observation from an aircraft that was barely controllable, with no opportunity for ground reconnaissance or safety verification. Sullivan's voice returned, with navigation information that showed they were running out of time for careful deliberation. Technical specialist Martinez, our fuel state is becoming critical for any extended maneuvering. We need to commit to a landing site within the next 30 minutes, or we'll be forced to attempt landing wherever we happen to be when fuel exhaustion occurs. The time pressure transformed the emergency from a complex problem requiring careful analysis to an immediate crisis demanding instant decisions based on incomplete information. Sarah realized that everything she had learned about aircraft performance, emergency procedures, and survival techniques was about to be tested in a situation where failure meant death for 3 people she had never met but whose lives now depended entirely on her knowledge and judgment. Rescue 77. Based on your fuel state and current conditions, I recommend you begin descent toward the largest lake in your area and start evaluating surface conditions for emergency landing. I'll provide guidance for approach techniques and landing procedures that account for your aircraft's current performance characteristics. The transmission committed both Sarah and the crew to a course of action that existed outside every safety protocol and emergency procedure in military aviation. They were about to attempt something that had never been tried under these conditions, relying on theoretical knowledge and improvised techniques to accomplish what should have been impossible. The descent toward the frozen lake began with Captain Rodriguez fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that seemed determined to kill everyone aboard. Sarah could hear the strain in her voice as she reported their initial approach, the words punctuated by grunts of physical effort as she wrestled with flight controls that had been compromised by ice accumulation and shifted weight distribution. Technical Specialist Martinez, beginning descent toward target lake. Aircraft control is extremely difficult. Every input requires maximum effort and response is delayed by several seconds. Sarah's mind raced through the technical factors that would determine whether this desperate gamble could succeed. Landing a C-130 on a frozen lake under normal conditions would be challenging enough, but attempting it with an aircraft operating at maximum gross weight, compromised by severe icing, and flown by an exhausted crew pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. The margin for error was essentially zero, with any mistake in approach speed, descent rate, or touchdown technique likely to result in catastrophic consequences. Rescue 77. Your approach speed needs to be at least 150 knots to maintain effective control authority with current ice contamination. That's significantly faster than normal landing speeds, so you'll need approximately 50% more distance for landing roll. Visual assessment of the lake surface is critical. Look for any signs of pressure ridges, snowdrifts, or rough ice that could damage landing gear or cause loss of control during rollout. The guidance Sarah was providing had never been tested. Under these specific conditions, combining theoretical knowledge of aircraft performance with educated guesswork about ice conditions and surface characteristics, she was essentially writing the procedure manual in real time, drawing on her understanding of C-130 capabilities and Arctic environmental factors to create landing techniques that existed nowhere in official documentation. Major Thompson's voice joined the communications with observations that added crucial information about the landing site they were approaching. Technical Specialist Martinez, we have visual contact with the lake surface. Ice appears solid with minimal snow cover, but we're seeing what looks like pressure ridges along the eastern shore. The main body of the lake appears smooth enough for landing operations, but wind conditions are still severe with gusts affecting aircraft control. The visual reconnaissance Thompson was providing gave Sarah critical data for refining her guidance, but it also highlighted the fact that they were making life or death decisions based on observations from an aircraft that was difficult to control, in conditions that made accurate assessment nearly impossible. The crew was essentially conducting a high-speed survey of an improvised runway while fighting to maintain aircraft control in severe weather. Rescue 77. Pressure ridges along the shore indicate the ice is thick and well established, which is good for weight support. Plan your approach to touchdown in the center of the lake, well away from any rough areas. Your landing roll will be longer than normal due to increased approach speed, so make sure you have adequate distance before any obstacles or rough terrain. Captain Sullivan's navigation expertise became critical as he calculated approach angles and distances that would give them the best chance of a successful landing. Technical Specialist Martinez, the lake is approximately 4 miles long and 2 miles wide, oriented northwest to southeast. Current wind direction would favor an approach from the southeast, but that would put us downwind, which increases our ground speed during approach. The navigation challenge highlighted another layer of complexity in their emergency landing attempt. Normal airport operations provided wind information and approach guidance that allowed pilots to land into the wind for maximum control and minimum ground speed. But landing on a frozen lake in severe weather conditions meant accepting whatever wind direction nature provided, regardless of whether it was optimal for aircraft operations. Sarah realized that they would need to modify standard landing procedures to account for the unique conditions they were facing. Rescue 77, given your compromised control authority, I recommend landing downwind to take advantage of the natural wind protection from terrain features. Your approach speed will be higher, but you'll have better aircraft control throughout the approach phase. Plan for a longer landing roll and be prepared to use maximum braking and reverse thrust. Dr. Reeves provided medical input that reminded everyone of the human factors affecting the crew's ability to execute this complex emergency procedure. Rescue 77. Be aware that extended high-stress operations can affect depth perception and reaction times. Take extra time for visual assessment and don't rush the approach phase. Crew coordination will be critical for successful completion. The medical advice addressed real concerns about how fatigue and stress could affect the precise flying required for their emergency landing attempt. The crew had been fighting severe weather for hours, burning through physical and mental reserves that couldn't be replenished while dealing with ongoing emergencies. Their judgment and manual skills were likely degraded at exactly the moment when peak performance was most needed. Rodriguez's voice returned with updates on aircraft systems that showed their situation continuing to deteriorate even as they prepared for landing. Technical specialist Martinez were experiencing increasing control difficulty as ice accumulation continues. Elevator response is becoming more sluggish, and we're having to use significant force to maintain desired attitudes. Engine performance on the remaining 3 engines appears stable, but power settings required for controlled flight are higher than normal. The systems report confirmed Sarah's understanding of how ice accumulation would affect aircraft performance. Throughout the emergency landing sequence, the crew was fighting an aircraft that was becoming progressively more difficult to control, with degraded response to pilot inputs and increased power requirements that were burning fuel faster than normal consumption rates. Every minute of delay made their situation worse. Rescue 77. Ice accumulation will continue to degrade control effectiveness throughout your approach. Plan for larger control inputs with delayed response and maintain higher power settings to ensure adequate control authority. Be prepared for the aircraft to feel heavy and sluggish compared to normal landing characteristics. Captain Chun provided meteorological updates that affected the landing site conditions in real time. Rescue 77. Surface winds at your target lake are estimated at 40 knots gusting to 55 knots from the northwest. Visibility is variable between 1/4 and 1/2 mile due to blowing snow. Temperature is -42 degrees Fahrenheit, which should ensure solid ice conditions. The weather information painted a picture of landing conditions that existed at the very edge of what was considered possible for aircraft operations. Attempting to land in 50-knot winds with limited visibility would be challenging enough under normal circumstances, but doing so with a compromised aircraft on an unimproved surface pushed the boundaries of aviation physics and human capability. Thompson began the final approach phase with systematic callouts that showed the crew was applying all their training and experience to a situation that existed outside every parameter they had ever practiced. Technical specialist Martinez were established on final approach at 160 knots. Descent rate 800 feet per minute. Ice conditions continuing but stable. Visual contact with lake surface is intermittent due to blowing snow. Sarah could visualize every aspect of what the crew was experiencing as they committed to the most dangerous approach of their careers. The C-130 would be bucking and shaking in the severe turbulence, ice crystals obscuring the windscreen faster than the wipers could clear them, control inputs requiring maximum physical effort to achieve minimal response. They were essentially test flying an experimental procedure with no opportunity for practice runs or safety margins. Rescue 77, maintain current approach parameters, but be prepared for wind shear and sudden visibility changes. Your touchdown point should be approximately 1/3 down the lake length to allow maximum rollout distance. After touchdown, maintain directional control and use maximum braking effort. The ice surface will provide good friction for stopping. The final phase of the approach required the crew to transition from the theoretical guidance Sarah had been providing to the practical reality of landing a compromised aircraft on a surface that no C-130 had ever touched before. Everything depended on the crew's ability to execute techniques they had never practiced while dealing with aircraft performance characteristics they had never experienced. Sullivan's voice carried the focused concentration of a pilot making the most critical approach of his life. 100 feet, approach speed stable, visual contact with surface. Ice appears smooth with good contrast for depth perception. 50 feet, crossing the shoreline now. The approach callouts painted a picture of professional aviators executing emergency procedures with the kind of precision that came from years of training and experience. But they were also flying into conditions that challenged every assumption about what was possible with their aircraft type, pushing the boundaries of both technology and human capability. 20 feet, 10 feet, touchdown. Rodriguez's voice carried a mixture of relief and continued tension as the Ki-130's main landing gear made contact with the frozen lake surface. But touchdown was only the beginning of the landing sequence. They still had to maintain control during rollout on a surface that had never been designed for aircraft operations. The sound of the aircraft sliding across the ice came through the radio as a combination of mechanical noise and atmospheric interference. But Sarah could hear that the landing gear was holding and the aircraft was maintaining directional control. The crew had accomplished something that existed outside every safety protocol and operational procedure in military aviation, proving that skill and determination could overcome conditions that defeated conventional approaches. Technical specialist Martinez were down and rolling on the lake surface. Aircraft is maintaining directional control, but rollout distance is longer than anticipated due to ice conditions. We're going to shut down engines and assess our situation. Rodriguez's voice carried exhaustion and relief in equal measure. The sound of someone who had just survived an experience that challenged everything she thought she knew about flying. Sarah felt her legs go weak as the magnitude of what they had just accomplished became clear. 3 pilots had successfully landed a compromised aircraft on a frozen lake in severe weather conditions, using techniques that had been improvised in real time by someone who wasn't even authorized to provide operational guidance. They had proven that expertise could triumph over authority, that knowledge could overcome regulations, and that human ingenuity could solve problems that defeated conventional approaches. The communications from Rescue 77 continued with systems checks and crew status reports that confirmed everyone had survived the emergency landing without serious injury. The aircraft had suffered additional damage during the approach and landing sequence, but the crew was alive and the immediate emergency was over. They were stranded on a frozen lake in the middle of an Arctic storm system, but they were no longer fighting for control of an aircraft that was trying to kill them. Lieutenant Colonel Webb approached the communications console where Sarah still stood, his expression unreadable but carrying none of the anger that had been present when she first violated protocol to contact the aircraft. The successful outcome of her unauthorized intervention had transformed a clear breach of military regulations into something more complex and difficult to categorize. "Martinez," Webb said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and uncertainty about how to address what had just occurred. "That was either the most brilliant or the most insubordinate action I've ever witnessed. Right now, I'm not sure which." The rescue operation for Rescue 77 began within hours of their successful emergency landing. But the complexity of extracting the crew and aircraft from a frozen lake in the middle of an Arctic storm system challenged every aspect of military logistics and emergency response capabilities. Sarah found herself at the center of planning efforts that required the same kind of innovative thinking she had applied to the emergency landing guidance, but now focused on solving problems that existed outside normal search and rescue protocols. "Lieutenant," Colonel Webb had made the decision to include Sarah in the official recovery planning, her unauthorized but successful intervention during the emergency having earned her a place at the operational table that transcended normal rank and role boundaries. The successful landing had transformed her from a maintenance technician who had violated protocol into a technical specialist whose expertise was suddenly recognized as essential for operations that pushed beyond conventional parameters. The aircraft is intact and the crew's in good condition, but they're stranded on a lake approximately 200 miles from the nearest airfield in weather conditions that make normal rescue operations impossible, Webb explained to the assembled planning team. "We need to develop extraction procedures that account for both the remote location and the continuing severe weather that's forecast to persist for at least another 48 hours. Captain Chun provided meteorological analysis that painted a picture of weather conditions that would challenge any rescue attempt. The storm system is beginning to weaken, but it's still producing winds of 40 to 50 knots with embedded severe turbulence up to 15,000 feet. Visibility remains near zero due to blowing snow, and temperature is holding at -40 degrees. Any aircraft attempting rescue operations would face conditions similar to what Rescue 77 encountered. The weather constraints meant that conventional helicopter rescue operations were impossible, and fixed-wing aircraft would face the same severe icing and turbulence conditions that had nearly killed the original rescue crew. The planning team was essentially designing rescue procedures for conditions that exceeded the operational limits of most available aircraft and crews. Sarah studied the maps and aerial imagery of the lake where Rescue 77 had landed, her mind working through technical factors that would affect any rescue attempt. The lake surface should be solid enough to support ground vehicles if we can find an overland route for access. The bigger challenge is that any aircraft attempting to reach them would need to deal with the same weather conditions that caused the original emergency. Dr. Reeves added medical considerations that influenced the urgency and complexity of the rescue planning. The crew has been exposed to extreme cold for over 12 hours now, and the aircraft's heating systems weren't designed for extended ground operations in these temperatures. Hypothermia and frostbite become significant risks if extraction is delayed much longer. The medical factors created time pressure that conflicted with the weather constraints, requiring rescue planners to balance the risks of attempting operations in dangerous conditions against the certainty that delay would compromise crew safety. Every hour of delay increased medical risks, while every hour of advancement increased operational risks. Major Thompson, who had been monitoring communications with the stranded crew, provided updates on their condition and capabilities. Rescue 77 reports that the aircraft suffered additional damage during the landing sequence, including problems with the nose gear and damage to several engine components from ice impact. The aircraft is not flyable in its current condition, so we're looking at personnel extraction rather than aircraft recovery. The aircraft condition assessment simplified some aspects of the rescue planning while complicating others. Personnel extraction could be accomplished with smaller aircraft or ground vehicles, but leaving a military transport aircraft abandoned on a frozen lake created security and environmental concerns that added complexity to the operation. Captain Sullivan, speaking from his position as the most experienced navigation specialist on the planning team, outlined potential routes for ground-based rescue operations. There's a winter access road that gets within about 50 miles of the lake, but the final approach would require tracked vehicles capable of operating in deep snow and extreme cold. Estimated travel time would be 18 to 24 hours, depending on weather conditions. The ground rescue option provided a backup plan that didn't depend on aviation assets, but it also meant exposing additional personnel to extreme weather conditions for extended periods. The risk assessment had to weigh the certainty of ground travel against the dangers of Arctic weather exposure for both rescue teams and the stranded crew. Sarah found herself contributing to planning discussions that would have been impossible for her to participate in just days earlier. Her technical expertise, now recognized as essential for operations that required understanding of both aircraft capabilities and extreme weather effects. If we attempt an aerial rescue, we need aircraft with different performance characteristics from the C-130. Helicopters are ruled out by weather conditions, but smaller fixed-wing aircraft might be able to operate with better ice tolerance and lower weight penalties. The suggestion opened up possibilities that hadn't been considered in initial planning, but it also required aircraft and crews with specialized capabilities that might not be immediately available. Every option carried risks and limitations that had to be balanced against the time pressure created by crew exposure and changing weather conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Webb coordinated with higher headquarters to obtain authorization for rescue operations that would push beyond normal safety parameters, his discussions reflecting the reality that conventional approaches were inadequate for the unique circumstances they were facing. We're getting approval for emergency rescue operations using non-standard procedures and equipment. The priority is crew extraction, with aircraft recovery as a secondary objective if conditions permit. The authorization provided flexibility for innovative rescue approaches, but it also placed responsibility for unconventional operations on field commanders, who would be held accountable for outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed under normal operational procedures. Webb was essentially authorizing experimental rescue techniques based on analysis and recommendations that existed outside established protocols. Captain Rodriguez transmitted regular status reports from the stranded aircraft, her voice carrying the professional calm that masked the stress of being trapped in conditions that challenged survival itself. Elmendorf Control, Rescue 77 crew condition remains stable, but aircraft heating systems are struggling with current outside temperatures. We're implementing cold weather survival procedures and rationing power consumption to extend battery life. The updates from the stranded crew provided real-time information about their condition while highlighting the time-sensitive nature of the rescue operation. Every hour of delay reduced their capability to survive in extreme conditions, while every hour of planning increased the likelihood of a successful rescue attempt. Dr. Reeves coordinated medical support for the rescue operation. Her preparations including cold weather medical equipment and procedures for treating hypothermia and frostbite that could affect both the stranded crew and rescue personnel. We're preparing for medical conditions that are outside normal emergency response parameters. Extended exposure to -40-degree temperatures creates risks that require specialized treatment and equipment. The medical preparations added another layer of complexity to rescue planning, requiring equipment and expertise that pushed beyond normal emergency medical capabilities. The rescue operation was becoming a comprehensive test of military logistics and emergency response systems under conditions that exceeded design specifications. Sarah worked with maintenance personnel to evaluate aircraft options for the rescue attempt, her analysis focusing on aircraft types that could operate in severe icing conditions with better performance characteristics than the 100 to 130. We need aircraft with lower wing loading and better anti-icing systems. The Navy has some aircraft configurations that might work better in these conditions, but they'd need different approach techniques and landing procedures. The technical analysis opened up inter-service coordination possibilities that required approvals and logistics coordination extending far beyond normal base operations. The rescue attempt was becoming a joint operation that tested cooperation and resource sharing between different military branches and commands. As planning continued through the night, Sarah found herself at the center of discussions that would determine whether 3 stranded aviators would survive their ordeal or become casualties of conditions that had already tested the limits of human endurance and technological capability. Her transformation from invisible maintenance technician to essential technical specialist was complete. But the real test would come when theoretical planning met the reality of Arctic rescue operations in conditions that challenged every assumption about what was possible. The rescue of Rescue 77 had become more than an emergency response operation. It was proof that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources, that knowledge could overcome authority, and that human ingenuity could solve problems that defeated conventional approaches. But the ultimate measure of success would be 3 lives saved from conditions that had initially seemed impossible to survive. 3 days later, a modified Navy P-3 Orion touched down on the same frozen lake where Rescue 77 had made their desperate landing. Sarah sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands steady on controls. She had been cleared to operate for the first time in 3 years. The rescue mission she had guided from the ground had become the flight that restored her wings. Captain Rodriguez, Major Thompson, and Captain Sullivan were extracted safely, their survival a testament to the power of knowledge applied at the critical moment. But the real victory wasn't just their rescue, it was the recognition that expertise doesn't always come with the expected credentials. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, her instructor wings gleaming on a uniform that finally matched her capabilities. She was teaching the next generation of pilots about extreme weather operations, heavyweight aircraft performance, and the importance of listening to voices that might not carry traditional authority. The most dangerous phrase in aviation, she told her students, isn't "watch this" or "hold my beer." It's "we've always done it this way." Sometimes survival depends on someone willing to say what others won't hear. The research team that had originally been stranded was eventually rescued by a ground expedition, their ordeal lasting a week but ending safely. Rescue 77 was eventually recovered and returned to service, but not before engineers studied every modification that had been improvised during the emergency landing. Sarah Martinez had learned that being invisible wasn't always a disadvantage sometimes. It meant you could see what others missed. And when the moment came to act, knowledge spoke louder than rank, competence mattered more than credentials, and the person everyone overlooked became the one who saved them all. What incredible story of hidden expertise have you witnessed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and determination inspired you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We bring you amazing real-life stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every week. Don't miss our next incredible tale. The authorization provided flexibility for innovative rescue approaches, but it also placed responsibility for unconventional operations on field commanders, who would be held accountable for outcomes that couldn't be guaranteed under normal operational procedures. Webb was essentially authorizing experimental rescue techniques based on analysis and recommendations that existed outside established protocols. Captain Rodriguez transmitted regular status reports from the stranded aircraft, her voice carrying the professional calm that masked the stress of being trapped in conditions that challenged survival itself. Elmendorf Control, Rescue 77 crew condition remains stable, but aircraft heating systems are struggling with current outside temperatures. We're implementing cold weather survival procedures and rationing power consumption to extend battery life. The updates from the stranded crew provided real-time information about their condition, while highlighting the time-sensitive nature of the rescue operation. Every hour of delay reduced their capability to survive in extreme conditions, while every hour of planning increased the likelihood of a successful rescue attempt. Dr. Reeves coordinated medical support for the rescue operation. Her preparations including cold weather medical equipment and procedures for treating hypothermia and frostbite that could affect both the stranded crew and rescue personnel. We're preparing for medical conditions that are outside normal emergency response parameters. Extended exposure to -40-degree temperatures creates risks that require specialized treatment and equipment. The medical preparations added another layer of complexity to rescue planning, requiring equipment and expertise that pushed beyond normal emergency medical capabilities. The rescue operation was becoming a comprehensive test of military logistics and emergency response systems under conditions that exceeded design specifications. Sarah worked with maintenance personnel to evaluate aircraft options for the rescue attempt, her analysis focusing on aircraft types that could operate in severe icing conditions with better performance characteristics than the 100 to 130. We need aircraft with lower wing loading and better anti-icing systems. The Navy has some aircraft configurations that might work better in these conditions, but they'd need different approach techniques and landing procedures. The technical analysis opened up inter-service coordination possibilities that required approvals and logistics coordination extending far beyond normal base operations. The rescue attempt was becoming a joint operation that tested cooperation and resource sharing between different military branches and commands. As planning continued through the night, Sarah found herself at the center of discussions that would determine whether 3 stranded aviators would survive their ordeal or become casualties of conditions that had already tested the limits of human endurance and technological capability. Her transformation from invisible maintenance technician to essential technical specialist was complete. But the real test would come when theoretical planning met the reality of Arctic rescue operations in conditions that challenged every assumption about what was possible. The rescue of Rescue 77 had become more than an emergency response operation. It was proof that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources, that knowledge could overcome authority, and that human ingenuity could solve problems that defeated conventional approaches. But the ultimate measure of success would be 3 lives saved from conditions that had initially seemed impossible to survive. 3 days later, a modified Navy P-3 Orion touched down on the same frozen lake where Rescue 77 had made their desperate landing. Sarah sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands steady on controls. She had been cleared to operate for the first time in 3 years. The rescue mission she had guided from the ground had become the flight that restored her wings. Captain Rodriguez, Major Thompson, and Captain Sullivan were extracted safely, their survival a testament to the power of knowledge applied at the critical moment. But the real victory wasn't just their rescue, it was the recognition that expertise doesn't always come with the expected credentials. 6 months later, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, her instructor wings gleaming on a uniform that finally matched her capabilities. She was teaching the next generation of pilots about extreme weather operations, heavyweight aircraft performance, and the importance of listening to voices that might not carry traditional authority. The most dangerous phrase in aviation, she told her students, isn't "watch this" or "hold my beer." It's "we've always done it this way." Sometimes survival depends on someone willing to say what others won't hear. The research team that had originally been stranded was eventually rescued by a ground expedition, their ordeal lasting a week but ending safely. Rescue 77 was eventually recovered and returned to service, but not before engineers studied every modification that had been improvised during the emergency landing. Sarah Martinez had learned that being invisible wasn't always a disadvantage sometimes. It meant you could see what others missed. And when the moment came to act, knowledge spoke louder than rank, competence mattered more than credentials, and the person everyone overlooked became the one who saved them all. What incredible story of hidden expertise have you witnessed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and determination inspired you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We bring you amazing real-life stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every week. Don't miss our next incredible tale.